Service. Hey everyone, welcome to Chef Sense. I'm your host, Chef Massey. All right, so welcome to the podcast. We have Matt Rubiner here from Rubiner's Cheesemongers.
Next door.
And this is probably the longest I've sat with you. This is probably the most time we've spent besides...
I feel bad.
No, I know, I'm teasing. What are you talking about? This goes both ways, right? So how are you?
I'm good.
You good? Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
So you're the cheese wizard.
I am a cheesemonger by...
And
I rarely throw around the W word.
I'm telling you, I mean, because, talking to Jasper Hill and people, and I've talked to some other amazing people on the podcast. There's people that I feel are predestined for something special. I think you're in that category in my book.
When's it going to happen?
And I think, right? Don't stop. Come on. No. I mean, but it's inspiring. It's like, let's kind of delve into Matt Rubiner, where this started for you and how this took off.
I hope my wife's not listening, because if I tell this story one more time, she's going to fall asleep driving.
Oh, uh-oh.
So I got into this business. I mean, my mother claims that as an early child, I showed hints of future cheesemongerism. She says I declared at some point, 6, 7, 8 years old, that someday I'm going to own a cheese shop.
Oh, that's awesome.
I have no recollection of that.
Okay.
Right. So, and then my grandfather was in the food business. And so I always had an appreciation. I always felt at home in kind of the food retail world.
Okay.
I love supermarkets. Still love supermarkets, which is weird because I'm in so many ways the anti-supermarket. But he was anyway. But I didn't get into this till I was nearly 30.
Oh, wow. Okay,
yeah, maybe even 30. Wow, who knows? I was doing other work, not super satisfied, not entirely dissatisfied, but feeling like there was something that might, satisfy a different interest, different passion. And I was living in Boston at the time.
Okay.
And I was working at MIT. And I decided I was just, I was very interested in food. I was kind of bored with my MIT friends. Hope you're not listening. And so I would, don, and I was a single, youngish man. So I would doll myself up in, my finest attire, and I'd go to the fanciest restaurant I could find in town. And,
nice.
And, carrying as pretentious as a book I could find in some language I couldn't read. And I'd sit at the bar and, or get a table and order a bottle of wine, imagining myself to be some connoisseur, which looking back on it was absurd. And I just started to meet people. I met chefs, and I met, sommeliers, and I met, front of the house people. I met wine sales people. I met producers. Mm-hmm. And it just became clear to me that just, that these were just incredibly... I don't go around throwing around the passion word too much, but these were just deeply passionate people who just seemed, I think they were, really satisfied with their work, with the common denominator being, artisan food and great food. And I kept doing that, and I got kind of a whole group of friends in that business. And then once a friend who was a wine sales guy at the time was like, hey, we were sitting in the north end of Boston, the Italian neighborhood, and sitting in Café de la Sport, which has to still be there, watching soccer on TV and musing, we really should just go to Italy. So he's like, well, I can probably wrangle a trip, through work. He worked for this company. So a lot of it would be paid for, and you can just tag along. So he set up this trip, and, I swear to God, it was... within a couple hours off the plane, as we're settling into his friend's wonderful pink hotel on the shores of Lake Como, where I was like, I'm missing out on something here. I want this to be part of my job. And then, the next day we went to this restaurant where his brother was doing a stage. He was a chef, still is, and was doing a stage at a restaurant in a town called Malgrate, I think it was called, on the other side of Lake Como.
Okay.
Where we were treated. We didn't know we were being treated. Thank God we were. We would have blown the budget for the entire trip. But I don't know if the restaurant's still there. But Michelin, 2-star restaurant. And we were out on this porch, and it was a cliff overlooking Lake Como, and it was the most gorgeous day. And and the food just kept coming out. It was just absolutely everything was perfect. Trout from the local stream, and this rabbit kidney salad from the and beautiful, beautiful wines from the region. And I was like, you know what? That's it. That's it. I'm done. We have to. I got to get in this business. So right then and there, I boldly declared, I'm getting in the food business. Wow. And then I came back and I was like, all right, now I got to get in the food business. I said it in front of people.
And, open the door.
Exactly. And so I kind of did a little research, tried to figure out, well, what do I want to do in the food business? Do I want to be in the wine business? I'm like, maybe, but I really don't want to be a salesman. I'm not much of a salesman. Do I want to be a chef? God, no. There's just not a bone in my body that could tolerate that. No, it's best for everybody that I never attempted to be a chef. Yeah. Or do I work for an importer? Do I do this, do that? And then a friend of mine said, what about cheese? There's a great cheese shop in town, this place called Formaggio Kitchen in Cambridge. Oh. Very famous now.
Oh, yeah.
It was famous then.
Wow.
But it was a very different world back then in the appreciation of cheese and food in general, I think, both in restaurants and in retail, was on the ascendant. So a friend arranged, she was having a winemaker dinner, I don't remember the maker, and had me sit down sat me next to the owner of this store. And I chatted with him a little bit. And then, a week or so later, went into the store and was like, hey, look, I'm thinking of leaving my job. Think you might hire me here? And I think, I know now that, people come into your store all the time and they're like, hey, this looks fun. I'd love to pick up a couple of shifts. And you're like, it's not fun, dude. I mean, it is fun, but it's also grueling work. And,
right.
And so I'm sure he felt like that. Here's some kid, coming in here. He's got a perfectly fine, presumably higher paying job than what I could get. Yeah. And he's like, yeah, you can work here, but I need you full time, and I'll pay you $6 an hour, which was the minimum wage at the time. Yeah. So I was like, sure, let's do it. Yeah. And I don't remember how long after that point, but within a month or so, started work at the cheese shop, quit my other job. Yeah. Got out of my, not fancy, but my little garret on top of a building in Beacon Hill in New York, and had to bail from that because, not New York, Boston. Couldn't afford that, so I moved in with a bunch of med students in a flop house in Central Square. Not precisely a flop house, but anyway, and then I was in the food business.
Wow.
And that's it. And so I was there, that store for, 6 years or so.
Okay.
And it was just at a time where not just that store, but as I was saying, the food business in general. And it's like we're talking now the early 90s. And celebrity chefs became a thing. And food TV became a thing. And people were more traveled, and maybe people were wealthier and beginning to understand food. And you began to see things like, artisan cheeses and other foods being produced at a level, albeit on a smaller scale, but at a level similar to Europe. And so it was just this kind of very sharp curve, and rode that for a while at the store. And then I was bodily thrown from the premises after 6-7 years. And,
jeez.
If that's one of the reasons I started my own store. If I had to work for anybody, I'd be fired in 5 minutes. Anyway, so then I did a little consulting, actual consulting, not just I'm unemployed, so I'm a consultant, consulting. Yeah. And then I had this opportunity to move out here and open a store, which isn't the store I'm in now.
Okay.
It was a store in Richmond.
Oh.
Yeah. In the only commercial building in Richmond where Jim's got his...
is that where GOP's at now? It used to be Marty's Local?
Yeah. So before it was Marty's Local, and before it was whatever the hell else was there.
Right.
It was the Richmond store.
Okay.
Which I opened with some partners.
Okay.
They had a cafe in the downstairs, kind of around back, called a Mono. And they were former... And there's a story as to how I found them. But I knew them as they were caterers in Boston, and we used to work with them at the store where I worked. And we became friendly, and they were like, hey, we got this old general store up there. There's nothing in it. We just use it for storage next to the post office there where Jim's stuff is now. And they were like, hey, do you want to come out here and open a store? And we were like, sure. And we did a little quick back of the envelope math, how much money could we make here? How's the clientele? And we took one look at that and threw it in the trash and was like, yeah, we'll do it. Because that doesn't make any sense. But, and we moved out. My wife left her job and became a freelancer. She's a clothing designer.
Yep.
And so we opened that store in Richmond, and that was in 2009. 2000, should know this because it was right about the time I got married. So 2001.
Okay.
And then the relationship with the partners there lasted, a few weeks before, went to hell. And then we managed to stick it out for a couple of years and then left there. And we were like, okay, no more bosses, no more partners. We're going to open up
some freedom,
a store. And we lucked into that space on Main Street.
Yeah.
We've been there we're coming up on, next week, 2 weeks from now, coming up on 20 years.
Oh, congratulations. That's huge.
It's huge in the sense that, it's huge, I guess, but it's huge in the sense that, it hasn't been smooth going. It's not, it's one thing I'm looking back and I'm like, wow, I'm kind of proud of that. It's like,
why, you
gutted out for 20 years. I know, but it's like, it was like, suddenly 20 years happened. We're just gutting away at it, plugging away, trying to stay alive.
Yeah.
And then next thing you know, you're an OG, you've been there for a generation.
Right.
So,
jeez. No, that's when you have rubies in the back, right?
We have rubies in the back, yeah.
So I'm assuming just cross-utilization of inventory, you'll see it. I've gone over there a couple times and...
Yeah. The cafe, which they opened about the same time. We knew we couldn't open both right at the same time. So the cafe opened the following July.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the cafe was something, we'd never been in the the restaurant, quote unquote, business.
Mm-hmm.
But we really felt, and just based on my experience, both as somebody who worked in the cheese business at that point for 7 or 8 years, but also somebody who knew people who had restaurants and clients of mine when I consulted, I really felt that a store like mine, where you're selling these rarefied, often extremely perishable ingredients, you need some kind of food service outlet. And that could be, if you had the right facilities for it and the right skills, you could do a prepared food program and stuff. But that's so difficult.
Oh, yeah.
Especially out here. And the other thing is we had no idea the seasonal, we had been told about the seasonal cycle in the Berkshires. And, it's a difficult place to run a business. Give people as many reasons as possible to come in. You know, we needed something that would make some money when the store was never going to, early in the morning. Wednesday, midday kind of thing. So we realized we needed a cafe. So we opened the cafe, and it was kind of hilarious. We had Alex Platt, from the Southfield store.
Oh, okay.
A couple other people were he worked for me in Richmond.
He's great.
When he was like 14.
Oh wow.
And then he was one of our first baristas. And,
okay. That makes sense now when I see him gunslinging back there.
Right, exactly. He was a great one. We felt we needed this cafe, and it more or less worked according to plan. And that when the store was, in the time of year where the store, just wasn't going to make any money, people still need their coffee, people still want their sandwiches. And then it has the very mundane function of kind of preempting waste. If we're going to sell fancy hams, we need to move more of that than we can actually probably sell to customers to keep it pristine. So we have a program where everything, it's not like we're using butt ends for the cafe.
No.
Quite the opposite, where they're taking all their meats and stuff directly out of our inventory.
That's what I was
so it keeps everything super fresh. And it works. Like as a restaurant, I think we have really little waste.
That's phenomenal. And that's a top discussion nowadays or the last few years. So looking at your store, do you want to share with the listeners kind of the actual gourmet variety that your store? Because you recently got your liquor, like you have wine. And
we got a wine and beer license after a decade and a half trying.
That was a big deal too. These are
that was the biggest. With hindsight, that was the biggest deal. Like we're doing much better now as a business. Now in the last few years since we've gotten that license than any of the years before. That really rounded out the picture. And that was our intent, to get that license when we moved here 20-something years ago. But it wasn't. It just wasn't going to happen. We tried periodically. It just wasn't going to happen. Politics, and kind of competing competitive interests were shutting us out of that. And that kind of fell apart in the last few years. And so we were able to finally score, a very deft legal argument. So we thought that we made over and over and over and over again as to why we should get a license, just fell on deaf ears for a long time. And then finally,
that's just great.
Things opened up. So, the store has, we call ourselves cheese mongers and grocers. And we call it, Rubiners, cheesemongers, and grocers. And we had a whole list of cutesy names for the business. But in the end, we were like, you know what? This is going to be my store. Everything in the store is going to be, however you want to put it. Some people say curated or whatever. I like to think of it as more as kind of filtered or tested by my palate.
Yeah,
I'm only
absolutely.
In a lot of, and that's just not like entirely just kind of pomp and ego. Certainly is to some extent, I'm sure. But but it's I can't sell stuff I don't like.
Yeah,
I can't have a customer come in and I'm pushing a product that I think the market will like, even though I myself don't believe in it. I just can't do that. I just physically cannot do it. I would just not going to lie to the customer. So it's much easier for me. It's much easier for my staff to just sell things that we truly believe in. So I was like, all right, well, I'm just going to put my name on I'm just going to call it Rubiners.
Yeah.
So people just know this is me, this is my taste, this is my palate. I want you to come in, I want you to try it. Maybe you'll like the same things that I do, maybe you won't. But it's all I know. It's how I'm going to do it. So, and then we were like, well, we're going to use cheesemongers because instead of cheese shop or something like that. And it was a term that's in much more currency now, but it really wasn't then. I mean, it's obviously it's an old expression. Cheesemonger, ironmonger, fishmonger. But it means somebody who gathers a product or commodity and brings it to market. Yeah. And we felt that the way we were going to go about this business was going to be as traditional as possible. Our mentors and our inspirations were old European shops and a few American stores that were really doing it in that very old-fashioned, hands-on, cut to order, caring for the cheese, ripening the cheese. So we decided to call it cheesemongers, and then we decided to append to that grocers because we didn't want to limit ourselves to that. There's so much more in the food world that was of interest to me. We did, obviously, for business reasons, you want to diversify somewhat. Yeah. But also, we take that role very seriously of kind of old school, roll up your sleeves. We're a grocer. I think we sometimes get branded, as kind of fancy or elite or whatever, and it's just the nature of the biz and the sort of products that we sell, even though I can say as an aside here that the most expensive cheese, the most expensive olive oil are that way because of the virtually peasant, tiny scale at which they're produced, which is an expensive proposition. It's not like we're just selling kind of frilly, fancy stuff for the most part. Yeah. But we want people to think of it, not everybody's going to, but we want people to think of it as a grocery store. Yeah. Right? Not just a museum of food, not some boutique that has kind of this and that on the shelves. We wanted it to be a grocery store, albeit, kind of a fancy grocery store, but a grocery store. So that guides, that principle guides the sort of areas that we, of food that we sell. So there's obviously cured meats and things like that.
And they're excellent, all of it.
And then there's, lots of ingredients, and then, candies and cookies and now wine. The only thing we never really pulled the trigger on and never will is fresh meat. Fresh produce, except in an extremely boutique-y way. There's somebody brings in some gorgeous
like Moon in the Pond, Dom.
Yeah, well, Dominic, so that's we kind of just give him our front porch there. He's awesome.
He's such a
he's one of my friends
character
out here and in this business.
Love it. Yeah, he's great.
So we say, it's Rubiners. It's kind of filtered through me. Cheesemongers, we're an old world cheesemonger. We're an old world cheese merchant, and grocers because we consider ourselves to be a grocery store, even if not your everyday grocery store, but we're a grocery store.
But you also have a finishing or ripening room too that you added. Is that right?
Yeah.
So that's a big deal.
That's a really big deal. That's still that is something we're learning to harness. It's the space, as you know, is a bank. It originally wasn't a bank. It was it was the town newspaper.
Oh, okay. I didn't know
Courier.
That. Oh, cool. Okay.
And I think I don't know if the Courier became something else or just disappeared. But and that was that building was built. I should know this because the dates are literally carved in the building. But I can't remember what they say.
I drive by it too.
So 1867, 1869 maybe. It was built, and it didn't have the pillars, and the overhang and the pillars.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No kidding.
I'll show you pictures, but
that's cool.
There were like wrought iron balconies.
Oh.
There's this great picture with people in women in like hoop skirts on the second floor, and then these kind of ghostly figures because presumably this wasn't the quickest shutter camera in 1869 or whatever. Right. So. you see these kind of weird ghostly images of people walking by. And
it's just plasma.
Yeah, exactly. It's just plasma. And then at some point, the courier moved. I think it moved just across the street, across the alleyway there.
Oh, okay.
And there was actually a house. There was a tiny little house in that alleyway.
Oh, okay.
And that house is now, it was moved, and it's now like right off of Route 7, like on one of those roads that cuts back to the courthouse there.
Oh, really?
You'll see it's this tiny little house that used to be,
okay.
at least that's what the historians tell me.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Wow.
And then it became a bank in 1917, I think.
Okay.
That's the other date, engraved on the side of the building, which I can't remember. And, so we took over this space, and the space had been all but abandoned. It was going to be if I got the story right, it was set to become a toy museum.
Oh.
Of all things.
Oh, my gosh.
And there was a guy who was this music impresario, wrote a few Elvis songs, a guy named Aaron Schroeder, owned the building. And I'm sure I'm getting the story wrong. I never actually spoke with him, but bought the building, started decking it out as like a museum for his collection of toys. If there's any relatives of the Schroeder family and I got this wrong, I apologize.
Yeah.
But then he got sick. And never completed, but held on to the building forever. Okay. So the building was more or less abandoned. So we were able to, when we left Richmond, we were able to lease it. Mm-hmm. But, it was an old bank, so it had a vault in it.
Yeah.
And, the first thought was like, how can we get that vault out of there?
Oh,
and
wow.
And we thought about that for 5 seconds, and then everybody was like, you can't get that vault out of there. Okay. And then, so we were like, well, someday we'll make use of it. And in fact, it was funny, another Southfield coincidence, like Alex Rich Holben, who lives there.
Oh, okay.
Like next door. He was our designer. He designed the space.
Okay.
And we were actually, when we moved into the space, we were like, we got to find a designer who can put this together the way functionally we want, but that kind of celebrates the space. Mm-hmm. And we were scouting around, talking to friends, and we went to a friend's bakery in Boston, High Rise Bakery, Cambridge, I should say. And we loved the way that they'd used this kind of, nondescript, industrial-looking old liquor store into this super cool space. And so we were like, hey, who designed your space?
Yeah.
And he's like, guy who lives out by you now is Rich Holben. So we contacted him, and then it turned out he had been contacted by the then owner of that building about turning it into a boutique hotel of some kind.
Oh.
And so where the store was like the lobby. There used to be an elevator in there. Gone. Yeah.
Wow.
I think the reason the place never sold is because the elevator was so out of code, and it would have cost an absolute fortune to rip out the elevator and put in a new elevator. But without that, the rest of the building couldn't be made like disabilities compliant. So it was kind of this, just this kind of unsellable space.
Okay.
Anyway, but he had already spec'd out the whole place.
Oh, okay.
And he had if I'm remembering correctly, there was going to be a little martini bar in the vault.
Oh, wow.
And where the cafe is now was going to be a little, little coffee shop, hotel. And anyway, so I forget what the question was, but
just the cheese, vault.
Oh, the cheese vault. So we always wanted to turn that into a cheese vault. I mean, it's perfect for it. It's got 3 foot thick reinforced concrete walls, and in fact, early on, I asked some contractors like, what would it take to put a drain in here? And they're probably still laughing. You know, because apparently under the vault is a 13-foot thick slab of concrete that goes all the way down to the basement floor and is reinforced with, I'm told, railroad rails.
Oh,
right?
Wow.
Because they had to keep, the Three Stooges from burrowing up underneath.
So much for Ocean's 11, I guess.
Exactly. So, but we never had any money. Small business in a small town is tough.
Yeah.
So, we didn't have a ton of money to put into that.
Yeah.
But then finally, in the last few years, we've been able to do that. So we've turned that into it's not so much a cheese ripening cave. I think, we call it, like the word in the cheesemongering trade, it's a French word, affinage, meaning to age and ripen cheese, to finish. The word means like to finish cheese. Yeah. And even English-speaking countries, they'll often use the word affinage just because, in English, you don't have a great word. Mature doesn't roll off the tongue like
not even
affinage.
Close, yeah.
So... And I don't think we do that except kind of playing around. What we do is we provide a storage space for the cheese that mimics the sort of caves the cheese would have spent its early days in.
Okay.
And then, or early many months or early years for some of these big cheeses that will allow the cheese to continue to develop. If you buy a cheese and you just pop it in the walk-in, it kind of, retards its development and growth. It's not, the cheese doesn't continue to develop. But if you have it in a humid environment, a slightly warmer environment, that kind of mimics, cellar temperatures or cave temperatures.
Like that 50?
Yeah, it's like, mid lowish 50s. 50. And really high humidity for the stuff that we're putting in there. Okay. So in the 90s. It's a little hard to control. We're still tweaking it.
Yeah.
And we had a kid build the shelves. We were looking around for a carpenter.
It looks really cool.
It's really nice in there. He built the most. It's funny that, some people, some of these I think I'd be offending anybody, but it's like these Steiner kids, the ones that
yeah.
It's like they're born with advanced German joinery techniques and stuff like that. This guy's like, I'll build shelving for you. And then we look at his prototypes. I'm like, oh my God, that's the most beautiful thing.
That's beautiful. Yeah, it looks so cool. Yeah.
And so he built us the shelves and it's great. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But it really does something that you can't do without it. That's kind of a vapid sentence. But, just for example, I posted this on Instagram, but we got a very special Gruyère. So a big wheel of Alpine cheese from Bern in Switzerland, made by a creamery called Fritzenhaus. And it's a cheese that 2 years running, and then every other year very close to winning the World Cheese Awards.
Wow.
Which are a serious set of, they're absurd of course to call something the best cheese in the world. Yeah. But that said, it was called the best cheese in the world, And it came in, and this was their Reife, not their most ripe, but their second to most ripe. But we bought it last November, maybe. Ordered it many months in advance. Comes more or less straight from Switzerland. And we put it in the cave, and we didn't set out to say, hey, let's age this for another 6-7 months. Oh. But you hit the off season, and we hadn't cut it yet, and we were like, let's just leave it in there and see what it does. So we just cracked it open 2 days ago.
Yeah.
And it's astonishing. It's astonishing. And we tasted it when it came in, and it was astonishing then. But so now we have this 20-month-old Gruyère. Yeah. And it's just absolutely perfection. And all we did to it was, we have this horsehair brush that we kind of scrape the mold off and flip it every couple of days. And for many months and then crack it open and you hope you didn't mess up this many thousands of dollar wheel of cheese.
No pressure.
And it was perfect. And, we couldn't have done that until we got that.
Yeah, that's
cheese
amazing.
Room or cheese vault, as we call it.
And that really sets it apart. So, in your mind, in tasting the two differences, what were the key components that you found? Were they more complex and kind of further along in the palate and hung out?
Yeah, longer? It's. I'd love to say we're more scientific about kind of taking notes along the way. But we're not. But the cheese was clearly. It was firmer. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it had lost some moisture. The flavors, and we know this cheese well in the sense that we've sold Gruyère from that producer for many years. So we have a good sense of the overall profile.
Yep.
Everything was much more intense, but without losing, sometimes you get a cheese or wine or anything where it's really intense, but it's kind of monolithic. You get intensity, but at the expense of breadth and richness and complexity. But none of that. It had managed to become more and more intense, firmer, but still as complex. And arguably in those final several months of its ripening, as fats break down, proteins break down, new, to their kind of constituent components that give it aroma, give it flavor. Yeah. New things are coming out of that cheese, which simply weren't there before and would never have come out without in fact, the importer emailed when he saw the picture. He's like, I'm coming up there. I want to taste it because he's never tasted one that old.
Oh, wow.
That's great. And then also one of the charms of those sorts of cheeses is that they get very crystalline.
There we go.
These little crunchy bits, and they're not really salt there.
But they're...
Although my chemist cousin, she was like, well, technically they're a salt, but. She's like, everybody when they hear salt, they think sodium chloride, but
this crystallization.
It's a to the extent of my still weak technical understanding, it is a crystallization of the amino acid tyrosine.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Which will also with tyrosine, tyros is Greek for cheese, and tyrosine is amino acid ends in that ine, and but you'll see tyrosine in. Do you ever cut a slice of prosciutto and you'll see a little white crystal in there? Same thing. Yeah, it's actually considered I'm not really sure why, but it's considered a flaw. It's considered like
No
a cheese-making
kidding.
flaw.
Wow.
I've had the pleasure and the honor of judging cheese competitions for a long time.
Yeah.
And in a lot of these competitions, they pair a so-called aesthetic judge, which would be like me, where you're judging a cheese on its look, its flavor, its aroma, maybe its kind of prospects for the market, that kind of thing. And then a technical judge who's judging it based on kind of industry standards.
Okay.
Or, this is flawed because of this. This imperfection in the rind is a flaw. Ding, take off the point there. This particular flavor is considered an off flavor. This aroma is considered an off aroma. Ding, ding, take a couple ticks off. Well, crystallization, ding, take it off.
I would have never thought
No, and I remember having this conversation. Wow. I'm sure he told me very lucidly why it's a flaw. I still don't understand, but it's so popular. It's maybe the most sought after component of cheeses when somebody comes in the store. They're like, we like hard cheeses with those crystals.
Yeah.
And people like it for the crunch.
Yeah.
I mean, people imagine, it's like some people come in and they think it makes the cheese sweet. They think the crystals might be sweet because when you age a cheese carefully and in the right conditions, it will often bring out a character of the cheese that is something like sweetness.
Yeah.
And some people imagine it to be salt because it just looks like salt.
Yeah,
so they threw in a bunch of salt crystals.
Right.
And a cheese that's that aged will necessarily be saltier than a younger cheese. Pretty much all cheese has salt in it for a lot of good technical reasons, not just flavor. Mm-hmm. And so they imagine these are kind of the salt crystals coming out.
Yeah.
And because the cheese is notably salty because it's been aging for so long. But no, if you were like to clip out a little one of those crystals with the tip of a knife and put it on your tongue and bite it, it just tastes like you're biting into a piece of chalk or something like that. It doesn't taste like anything.
Wow. Okay.
But yeah, it's crazy. And you can see
funny.
them. You look at the cheese and people are like, what are your crystalliest cheeses? And we're like, this one, this one, this one. But you can look, all those little white spots are what you're crunching.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
So.
Wow. As you're kind of gauging, because there's so much amazing selection, and going in there it really is such a beautiful craft that you do.
Thank you.
It takes you on this journey that, like, I'm not even in Great Barrington. Like, I'm not even, as a chef, the minute even walking in there, I can smell, and it just kind of, there are certain attractions to certain things. When you look at cheeses and you develop your broad selections, how do you work through all of that? I mean, it's probably monotonous and with a team and travel and...
None of that sounds monotonous. We travel.
Well,
we dash off to Switzerland. The cheeses, I mean, going back to what I was saying before, the cheeses are, I buy and sell what I like and believe in. And so much of that is not just the quality of the cheese, the flavor and so forth, but it's the people who make it.
Okay.
Or in some cases, the people who import it.
Yeah.
And so, though the basis for what I do is based on having, worked in this other store in Cambridge, but also done a good deal of traveling to the places that these things were made and meeting the people, both throughout the United States and not as much as I would have liked of Europe. But, when you open a store in a small town or anywhere, it kind of ties you down. It takes up all your money. Right. And you can't just go dashing off for a couple of weeks, So a lot of that is based on the relationships that I made and the networks that I made, and I stay in touch with these people.
And the trust. Right?
And trust is 100%.
Crucial.
Trust is key. Yeah. So, and that's not just the cheese, that's everything in the store. We have certain kind of actually written down principles to our buying. Sometimes we violate because it's getting harder and harder, but we'll never sell anything, we say, that is owned by a parent company, say, so, which is getting tested because big companies keep buying American artisanal and European artisanal cheesemakers. Okay. So it's being sorely tested right now. But no, that's actually, you say monotonous, but that's to me the most fun thing is finding new stuff. And getting it here however possible. And, there's a lot of restrictions and it's much harder now than it used to be.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah. It used to be easier only because it was easier to flout the law. I mean, certain laws governing the importation and selling of cheeses in particular are used to be very loosely enforced if you played ball and weren't doing anything stupid. And so, you could bring in raw milk camemberts, you could bring in raw milk reblochon, things like that. But after 9/11, when there were all new layers of administration put onto the movement and import and selling of food in the name of like bioterrorism protection and stuff, suddenly everybody at every level's got to fill out all these forms, and it became really hard. So it's hard to bring in some of the things that we used to bring in, but again, it's like I have to love the cheese. I have to know how it behaves. You know, the thing about being a cheesemonger, and this is true in so many jobs, but the key skill, I think, is building in your head, in your senses, like a database of how a particular cheese or particular style of cheese should behave. So that you can tell by looking at a young cheese how it's going to develop.
Before you get into it.
In the sense that it's not real science, but in the same sense that a wine importer might go to a vineyard and taste a barrel sample that's not going to be bottled for years hence. But be able to, based on how many barrel samples of that type of wine, or maybe even that particular vineyard, you'll get a sense of how it's going to develop, and you'll base your decisions on that. And that really, as a cheesemonger, that really guides everything you're doing with the cheese. There's some cheese I love, but I just know they're not going to hold up in the environment that I would have to put them through. And there are many things, when cheese comes in the door, the first line of defense, and I look at it and be like, it looks fine now, but there's something about the way, something I see in the wine, something in the aroma, something that I can just feel, and I'm like, no, I got to refuse this one. This one's not going to work. Or if I imported it myself, more or less, can't really refuse it, but there might be a particular way to handle it.
Okay, very interesting.
But yeah.
Wow. And so I know that there's competitions out there, and I mean...
More and more every day.
I mean, are they once a year, or is this going on all year long?
I meant the competition.
Like cheese. Oh. Well...
there are competitions. Well, there's one big one in the United States. Well, I guess there's another one. There's like a world cheese thing that I've never participated in. But the big one for American... Well, there's a big global one, the World Cheese Championship. I think that's what it's called. And... But the American one is put on by the American Cheese Society. And that's where I've done all of my judging.
Okay.
And that started out, when I first started judging, there might have been, I think, 70 or 80 cheeses entered. Now there's thousands entered into these competitions.
As I talk to people in our industry as a whole, it's so interesting that our skill set as chefs, our tools in our kitchens, our people, our craft people, it almost was like early 90s, maybe a little late 80s, but early 90s, it just started erupting, and it just took off. I think that's amazing to see, because in our country, I'm trying to wrap my head around, well, in the first place, I know we're relatively a new country. Why was there such a stall between our founding and as we grew as a country, that our food scene kind of just was there, stuck in a sense. And then all of a sudden, there was this eruption for everyone in our industry to go, wow, this is a whole new world, and adding all these cheeses and all this product. I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, it's interesting.
I mean, to me, that was a thrilling time. And, I don't know that it's ascending at the same kind of rate or angle, but, like you were saying, starting in the early 90s, maybe in the 80s, I don't know, I got in the business in 94. Like I was referring to before, you suddenly saw, like when I was a little kid, going to a fancy restaurant meant going to like a old chop house, and your parents would dress you up, and, you'd have a filet mignon or a baked potato, or, and then, or there was surf and turf, and you had a chunk of crab or lobster or something like that, and that was fancy, and it was fancy. But then where, I'm really not much on like the history of restaurants and stuff, but you began to see people, kind of breaking out of that sort of traditional mold. And I always thought that this was, kind of just by sheer force of the personality of some, real genius chefs, as far as restaurants goes, supported by a population that, I don't want to wax on too much because I really don't know, but it seemed to me, because I got in the business around then, and it just seemed like people from the time that I started in that shop to even just a year or two later, the knowledge that customers had.
Birth of the foodie.
The travel, the birth of the foodie, the travel that people had done. The chefs who were, I was living in Boston or Cambridge, and, there were a couple chefs who would, did things that was just so opposite of like the Nouvelle Cuisine or something like that.
Jasper White or
Todd English and Barbara Lynch and people like that who were just like, you're just piling on incredible flavors and, doing
Slow
stuff,
food.
Yeah, exactly. And it was like that in my business as well. Like a lot of the cheeses that we found, quote unquote, were because a customer would come in and they were like, oh, I was skiing and, wherever people ski.
Yeah.
And I found, I had this cheese and we'd be like, all right, we're going to get it.
Yeah.
So, we'd make the calls and we'd do this and we started importing ourselves. This is back in Cambridge. And just bringing in these wild things that we would not have known about. And then there was an audience for them willing to pay the premium that it would takes to get these things into the country. But also suddenly there's movies about food, that are wildly popular.
Going past
Big
the Galloping
Night,
Gourmet.
and exactly. And then and food TV and a different generation of people's appreciation of maybe more authentic, what we unfortunately still call like ethnic food and stuff. It's like suddenly Italian food didn't mean just the red sauce joint. It might be a Tuscan place. It might be exactly. Yeah. It was a really golden time.
Really cool.
And then the store just, not because of me certainly, but I was participating in, transformation of that store in the way that cheese shops did business. And there were a few stores around the country that we worked with or were doing similar things, not many. Then also at the same time, there were factors that led to the development of a very high quality American cheese industry.
Yeah.
There was a time when there were simply there were a couple. There were a few goat cheeses, simple things out there. Capriole in Indiana, Laura Chanel. Some of these old school, these hippie chicks. I remember one from Capriole who was like, there are two types of people who make cheese. The hippies who don't mind poverty and the rich guys who don't mind losing money. And she's like, when you see those big, German guys in Wisconsin start making artisan cheese, you'll know we've made it. And, sure enough.
And here we are,
but you began to see, because I think there's so many factors, but there was this movement away from the cities, like people who, wanted to kind of take to the country, whether they were people who had money or people who were just kind of sick of the rat race.
Yeah. Okay.
And started making cheese. And though a very difficult business to be in, for the first time maybe ever, there was an understanding or an increasing understanding of what they were doing, and therefore an increasing market for what they were doing. And it's a slog, but I think, I've never been a cheesemaker, but I know it's a slog of a business, but it's a business where people can make a living. It's a lot of work. Whereas before it really wasn't something like that. It was, you made a cheese and you took it to the farmer's market. You made a cheese, and if it was really good and you lived in LA or something, you sold it to, a chef, or you sold it if in the Northern California, you sold to Alice Waters or something like that. And or in New York, similar things. But now it's a vibrant industry filled with really wonderful cheeses that, are shoulder to shoulder with the best European cheese.
Which is phenomenal, which is great to see.
Incredible.
We're doing it. So do you have any words of wisdom? Anything that you would share? None. Oh my God.
Don't do what I did, kids.
Yeah. But somebody that has this, affection for cheese and wanting to these finer things and want to get into the industry, how do you nurture someone along? You have Ben, which I actually have Ben in my cell phone. It's Ben Rubiner, by the way.
There you go. A lot of people think he's my son.
But what are your words for that? Like cutting your teeth and how? It's a lot of studying, right? A lot of tasting.
Depending on how deeply you want to go into it. Like, there's no way to go into it and really learn it, whether that be as a cheesemonger or a cheesemaker. Without. There's a great deal of knowledge that needs to be, if not mastered, you need to have enough of a framework of the knowledge, whether that be, more technical or aesthetic components of it or business components about the cheese, that you can actually tell a good story. The reason I went, I may have skipped this, but the reason I chose cheese over all these other professions was, I was in kind of academia before this, and, and kind of a student of history and very interested without, kind of jack of all tradesing, all sorts of academic interests, interested in science just enough to want to read a few books about, this and that. And when I went into, cheese for me, and wine is the same way, and many other things I'm sure, but you can look at a cheese from so many different angles. You can look at it, just straight up kind of the history of that cheese. You can look it up scientifically. You can look it up from, a geological perspective. You can look it up you can look at it through the lens of like the history of like conquest, the movements of people, you can look at it through the, through the, the history of animals in a particular region. I mean, there's a million different, ways to look at a piece of cheese. I always said that a really good cheesemonger, I might just be making this up, but a really good cheesemonger could look at a cheese, like a whole cheese, come up with a plausible story on how that cheese developed just by looking at the cheese. Okay. It doesn't really work in America because, like you were saying, our traditions here are so young. So if you're making a cheese in America, you just make whatever you want, basically. Whatever your land will give you, whatever your animals will give you, how much space you have, how much staff, whatever capital. Whereas in Europe, these traditions are so old. That's why, in one place, they're all making a similar cheese. And this particular cheese developed in the mountains. And this particular cheese developed in the hot islands in the Mediterranean. And, every cheese in this region is made with sheep milk. No cheese above the Loire Valley, with some exceptions, is made of goat's milk. The richer places, big monastic land holdings and stuff, were cow's milk because, the peasant, the poor couldn't afford to herd a cow, or the land to graze them. So, again, I think I've wandered off on a cheese tangent. But so getting in the business. So if you really want to get in the business as a career, which a lot of people do, but not as many as you need, you really got to dig in pretty deep and try to understand this stuff. But there's no shortage of avenues into it. There's no such thing as a cheese shop in this country, a good cheese shop in this country that's not looking for help. And there's no such thing as a cheesemaker that, or at least a decent sized one that doesn't take an intern or always needs some help. Or it takes a certain type, just like it takes a really weird type to go become a chef. You sign up for that and it's like, the chance of you making great money doing it is probably not great overall, and the hours are absurd and there's all kinds of pressures, and then the actual running of a restaurant or a small, cheese shop or a cheesemaker, something like that is pretty brutal. No matter where you are, I see more stores in big cities going out of business than I do like little country cheese stores. Because it has its own pressures. So I think anybody who wants to get into it, there's no shortage of kind of entryways into it. Find a good cheese shop or find a good, and then there's lots of, support out there these days. The American Cheese Society, which has gotten quite big, maybe a little too big for my taste, but, like anything else, you got to fund it. If you're going to fund it, you got to fund it with people with money. The people that make money are like, craft. But I'm probably being unfair, but there's lots of resources. There's now actually a certification, which I don't have. Maybe someday I'll get, but it's one of those like, I've been doing this for 30 years. I don't need some kid telling me how. But there's a certified cheese professional, like certificate, I guess you'd call it. That is administered by the American Cheese Society. So a lot of young cheesemongers are preparing for that and getting into that. It's a great business. It's
Jasper Hill, I think. I remember them mentioning something about some classes or education they do up there.
They do a ton of stuff. They do.
They're unbelievable.
They're
7 vaults and insane.
I was just up there
magic.
A couple of weeks ago. They had a summit with Northeast Retail Summit, and they chose a few cheese shops. Come up there and just kind of hash it out. Talk about the state of the business, talk about what concerns us, them telling us in a very candid way what their pressures are. But they're the benchmark.
They're amazing.
They're amazing on just every level. Man, I was up there just for a weekend, and it was like I just felt like everybody I met, not just the employees of Jasper Hill, from through and through, from Matteo, the owner, he and his brother, but to the farmers they work with, the people, raising their hay, the people they're buying their milk from, the people, working in their satellite farms or whatever. Everybody just seemed like a genius to me.
They're just on it.
They just know their craft so well,
that's so great.
Through and through. It was wild. Like we were visiting their main farm, where the milk is made that they use for their raw milk cheeses. And And, they got a couple guys working there, and they're this one kid, Bubba, local guy, and this is a deeply impoverished part of Vermont. I think I can say that, the Northeast Kingdom, it's just, middle of nowhere, and it's a lot of downtrodden farms and real pressures. And this guy, I think it was very much of that, from that difficult upbringing, that difficult world. He was just like, as Matteo put it, I've never met somebody who loves cows as much as this guy. And he just knew. Very cool. And he could, they didn't give the cows names. A few had names from previous lives, but he could just look at a cow and just tell you, exactly the volume of milk it was giving, exactly what it ate, exactly its weight, exactly everything about it, what its genetic makeup was. Mm-hmm. And without thinking about it, without checking a list, it was just of him, And everywhere we went, it was just like that. And it was almost like they spoke in this kind of poetry. It was weird. It was just everything they say, it's like, and especially when we were touring places where, like the creamery and the caves and stuff at Jasper Hill, and it's very hygienic. So and it's also very proprietary. So they frown on you whipping out your phone and taking out your notebook. So my brain is like, shit, how am I going to remember this? I'm trying to think of mnemonic devices to remember all the brilliance that I'm hearing on this trip. But Jasper Hill is a remarkable organization.
Yeah, no kidding. It was great talking to them and kind of hearing more about, what they're doing. And like you said, I'd love to get up there someday. Maybe that'll be a field trip someday.
Fantastic. But they do a cheese camp. Ben's
That's
going up
what
to cheese camp.
Yeah. Okay.
We went a few years ago. Sophie works in the store. She went up to cheese camp.
Okay.
And that's something they do.
Which is great. I mean,
that's amazing.
Yeah. And I know at Cricket Creek, I would take, we'd go up there and do some cheese. I think we were tinkering with a Maggie's Round or something. Right. So, but you get an appreciation where it's mind opening that it's more than just grating it, or shaving it. It's like,
when you see what goes into it, I often say that, and it sounds kind of defensive, but, people will lament the prices of artisan cheeses. What? 25, 35, 45, 50, $55 a pound, how can you charge that for this? I'm like, you know what the margins on this stuff are? It's so slim.
Yeah.
And the work that goes into it. I mean, Jasper Hill, because of economic pressures, and if I have the story straight, in COVID, they had to sell their herd. I mean, they couldn't, the economics of doing all that they do and being their own milk suppliers. Now they've since bought a farm and supply a great deal of milk actually from cows that they own. But it's no longer on Jasper Hill Farm. And there's talk that, if they are able to expand, if there is a market for expansion of what they're doing, then maybe reintroducing cows. But and you see what goes into this and the circumstances and the risks and and then, the equipment, they're artisan cheesemaker. I mean, they're getting big for an artisan cheesemaker, but they're still very much an artisan cheesemaker. But I'm like looking at this stuff and I'm like, hey, what's this set you back? And it's like, that's $500,000.
Yeah.
That unit right there. Or, hey, we got this tractor, our lease is running up, our tractor they use for hay and stuff. Right. And they're like, $500,000. These things cost.
Unbelievable.
Crazy.
Yeah, no, and that's the tough thing. I think people need to have that level of appreciation. It goes a long way.
We talk to the cheesemaker, like, so what time did you get in this morning? It's like 1:15. And it's like 11 in the morning now. He's like, I'm just wrapping up my shift.
It's like, where have you been?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're wasting a day getting up at 7 a.m. Wow. Well, so what are your favorite cheeses? Is it one of those things where it's like they're all my children, so I have to love them all equally? How is that? Absolutely not.
Well, as in real life, no. I don't have a favorite cheese. Yeah. And it's maddening for customers because it's a common question. What's your favorite cheese? Yeah. And, what I should do is lie. This one.
Yeah.
But it's so difficult. And it's difficult in a way, in the same way as like, which one's your favorite kid? Yeah. But I think most parents will tell you they do have a favorite kid. But it's, you're talking about moving targets. Mm-hmm. There might be a cheese that, generally speaking, is among my top 20 cheeses. Okay. But that doesn't mean that cheese on that day is going to be my favorite cheese. I mean, these things are changing. The cheese that, we brought in at 13 months old or 15 months old is a very different cheese when we pull it out of the cellar at 20 months. That's when we cut that wheel, that's one cheese. When we put it out for the day, at the end of the day, it's subtly another cheese. And as it goes, it changes. One batch of a very soft, let's say Jasper Hill Harbison or something like that. Because it's an artisan cheese closely tied to the land and the lactation cycles of the animal and stuff like that, it's going to be different.
Right.
The composition of the milk is going to be different, so it's going to yield a different cheese. This isn't an industrial product.
Right.
So and that's to me the charm of artisan products. There's variation. Hopefully within a certain range of quality.
Yep.
But I can't just say Harbison's my favorite cheese.
Yeah.
Because there may be days where that specific Harbison isn't my favorite cheese.
Or during
this
that.
is.
Okay.
So, I mean, I tend to, I don't have an answer for you. There used to be kind of types of cheeses that I didn't like. There's a style of cheese that is typical in Western Spain, Eastern Portugal, the so-called Serra cheeses. Every time I try to pronounce anything remotely Portuguese, and then I hear a Portuguese person pronounce it, I'm like, wow, I didn't get anything right. But sheep milk cheeses, raw milk, the milk is coagulated not through rennet, which would be typical, or another way to coagulate it. It's done through an extract of thistle seed, a very ancient way of doing it, which does all kinds of things to the cheese, but creates this, among other factors, creates this very, very rich, quite strong, depending on how you look at it, both aromatically and in flavor, very animal, not in like a gross way, but like, in
like a barnyardy.
Like barnyardy, but like, the bedding in a sheepfold, it's kind of like wet grass and just enough of the smell of the lanolin. But it has a real sweetness to it. And then sometimes it has this odd, like, kind of almost like berry note to it, like strawberry note kind of to it. Oh, that's
cool.
I thought it was just the grossest category of cheese. Like, I don't know how anybody eats this. I'll sell it. But, over time, I just learned to love that just as much as the others. Of course, I always hated fennel, and now I like fennel, and couldn't eat cilantro, and now I like cilantro.
So like the redheaded stepchild.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't think I have a favorite. Unless you ask me, what's your favorite at this second? And it's probably, I taste a bunch of cheeses every day. So it's probably the answer is going to be the one of those cheeses that was doing the best that day. And you ask me tomorrow, I might not have the same answer.
Well, maybe people need to see you every day then.
Come on in.
Enjoy it.
We're here daily.
There you go. Well, so how can the website for both the cafe?
No, we're reworking a lot of stuff right now. So our website, which was, feeble, and I think that's actually a diagnostic term in the tech industry, to just horrible, to outdated. Somebody was like, hey, I bought a sandwich in your cafe and it says on your website it was $7, but it was $20. I was like, because I haven't changed the price in 10 years or something. Oops. So we're working that now. So, the best thing to do is come on in. And look at our Instagram and stuff, because that's where anything new, anything cool, anything that takes a pretty picture.
And you guys do boxes, built boxes, and all of that. So set up an order.
But we're really very much cut to order. Like, I'm amazed how many people just kind of need to go out and buy a quarter pound of this, quarter pound of that, quarter pound of that. It's like, it used to be, as a kid, I never went to a cheese shop to go buy cheese.
Now it's...
But it's very, very hands-on, and we're very in tune with what's going on with our cheeses at any given time. So hopefully we're able to deliver to a customer a cheese that's in perfect condition, and handled properly, wrapped properly. But the best thing to do is come in, and I would say a pretty big portion of the people who come in are maybe a little intimidated by a cut to order cheese shop, because there are weirdly few of them. A lot of stores kind of look like a cut to order cheese shop, or they'll cut a bunch of pieces and put it out and whatever. And, that's a cheese shop. But they don't realize they could come in and ask these questions and taste most everything. And really get the advice of the people so that we can put something together. And there's no substitute for customer satisfaction than, better than actually tasting it.
Right, exactly.
You know, when you get it home, you're going to like it before you bought it, you tasted it.
Right.
So
that's awesome.
That's the best thing to do. Come in, taste a bunch of stuff.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Any sort of cheese classes in the future? Or
I think so. We were doing them, and COVID hit. We weren't doing a ton because, staffing,
It's
which
tough.
basically means if we're doing a cheese class, I'm doing it, which means I'm not making dinner. And I've just worked a double for 20 straight days or something. So so we didn't do many of them, and the ones we did, we were doing mostly for charities. Silent auction, get a cheese class for you and your friends. We're going to be easing back, and then COVID put an end to that. For a while, especially because we closed the cafe for 2.5 years, so there was really no place to host these things, and
the whole
destroyed economies and global disaster. Was pretty good for our business, in ways that, real two edges of a sword ways that we all experienced living in the Berkshires.
Right. Some of the local farms, that was a shot in the arm.
It's like a lot of people moved up here, which of course has some adverse effects. We got no place for any of our staff to live because everything's
it's tough.
But on the other hand, it brought up a clientele that was very interested in what we're doing. Kind of juggled in my brain is like, how do you manage this? We gotta, we need affordable housing. We need affordable places.
Yeah.
But I need a couple fancy people in town to come, buy my fancy cheese and stuff.
It's a tough mix.
But COVID was between getting the wine license just before COVID.
Oh yeah, I didn't
and then
realize.
COVID hitting and people, rapidly, increasing their alcohol intake. It was like.
Right.
Before it was, I'd like looking for a bottle I'm having a steak tonight, whatever, I'm looking for a bottle. Now it was like 11 in the morning. What white wine goes good with an 11-year-old? It's like...
Yeah. You got any Corbett Canyon? No, I don't think so, bud.
It was and the plateau is very different. There's just more people up here now. And so it's not like during the middle of COVID when kids were out of school and people were just flat out living up here. But
still.
But it's a thorny issue. But it's been a good stretch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
for
Matt,
business.
Thank you for your passion,
pleasure.
Man. You're very humble, but I think it's just it's great to to go into what you are so passionate and the team that you have. It is an artist at work, right?
Very.
It's not.
I always say art dealer.
There you go.
I'm not the artist. Just selling the art.
Well, I don't know.
Finding and selling the art.
Your name is excellence, and that's why it's where you put it. So thank you.
Pleasure.
Yeah, all right, everyone. That is a wrap. You can check us out if you like that. Subscribe. Also, the Instagram, Chef Massey. Let's keep it simple. ChefMassey.com. Have a good one. Bye for now.